Hey, Jay Carper from American Torah here, and I want to talk about David, Abigail, and Nabal. Now, everybody knows the story of David and Bathsheba, but the story of David and Abigail isn't told quite as often. Um, Now, this is from 1 Samuel chapter 25, and I'm not going to read it because it's just about the entire chapter, verses 2 through 39. Now, just for some background, this is when Saul was still officially the king, but David had been anointed as king, and he was on the run from Saul. David was gathering, you know, men who didn't fit in anywhere else, misfits, men who were in debt, who were in trouble somewhere. He had gathered his what became known as David's mighty men. These were great warriors, plus a lot of other men who were loyal to David, but who weren't necessarily wanted in polite society. So by this time, David had at least 600 men. In the story, 600 men are mentioned. He probably had other people, camp followers. There were probably women who worked in the camp. A lot of these men probably had servants of their own. They probably had families. So he had quite a following. He was pretty much, his camp was a city all by itself. Um, Now, David spent most of his time essentially policing the wilderness. He was, Saul would have called him a brigand, a highwayman, but really David was doing the king's job. He was out there patrolling the wilderness, keeping the roads safe, keeping the shepherds who were out in the fields, keeping them safe from raiders and from foreign armies, maybe even from Saul's men for that matter. Um, they earned their keep, probably somewhat gleaning from fields. Since they didn't have land of their own, or at least they weren't occupying their own land, God's law allows them to pick the leftovers and the corners, that kind of thing, from other people's harvested fields. They probably also hunted, but mostly they existed at uh, the largesse of the people they were protecting. Local ranchers would donate to them, local farmers would donate food. Um, when at certain times of year, at the various harvest times, and at times um, when the sheep, especially, were ready to be fleeced, these were party times in an agricultural society. They still are today to a great extent. There was an abundance, and all of the workers were called in, and lots of partying went on. There were feasts, there was drinking, there was it was like the county fair. Um, Now, in this region, there was a man named Nabal. He was extremely wealthy. He had many thousands of sheep, thousands of cattle, camels, all kinds of animals. And he had a large uh, worker base who looked after his animals and his crops. Um, he probably didn't have as many men as David did, but he certainly had a lot. And when you have that many animals, they have to wander. They take their herds out into the wilderness to graze because you may not have enough land of your own to support these animals. And this was accepted practice. It's just what they did. The problem is when you went out into the wilderness, you weren't safe. There were raiders and highwaymen out there who could rob you. Of course, wild animals. You never knew what you were going to encounter. So the shepherds were always armed, of course. Uh, just about everybody was armed in one way or another. But that really wasn't enough. So David, he would help protect these shepherds. He would keep them safe from people who would want to steal their sheep, maybe even kill them and take the whole herds. Um, when these men came back to Nabal, they reported that, David, when they were working with David, they were always safe. David's men never stole from them, never caused them a problem. They were safe from raiders and from foreigners. David made a great guard for all of these herds. Now, when Nabal called in all of his herds, he wanted to fleece the sheep. He threw a big party, as was the custom. Um, I mean, you really couldn't get away with not doing it. Uh, Nabal was not a nice guy. He was stingy. He didn't want to pay anybody anything. He mistreated people, but he had to throw this party, or he wouldn't get anybody to come and work for him and help him fleece his sheep. So he did the bare minimum he had to do to get the workers to come to him. Now David heard that he was fleecing his sheep, and he said, "Hey, when the farmers bring in their crops, when they bring in their animals, that's when we get paid." And now there's no contract. Nobody had asked David to come and do this service. Nobody had asked him to police the wilderness. And in fact, Saul was after him to kill him half the time. And Nabal especially, he hadn't offered to pay David anything. It was just the custom. If somebody does you a good thing, you do something good too. You treat your neighbors the way you want to be treated. So David was out there with all these men. Why not protect them? Why not offer his services? He was the anointed king after all, and everybody already knew this. This wasn't a secret that David was the legitimate king of Israel who just hadn't sat on the throne yet. So David was perfectly within his rights to use his small army to guard Israel's frontier. So when he heard that Nabal was fleecing his sheep, throwing a big party, he sent a small group of men, just 10, and sent them to Nabal and said, "Hey, you know, whatever you've got extra just laying around, give it to my men, and that would just be great. We could really use the help." Nabal, despite David ensuring his wealth, I mean, he didn't send enough men out there to guard his own flocks. And David kept his men and his flocks perfectly secure wherever they went. So David had actually saved Nabal lots of money. And Nabal was so ungrateful, he said, "Not only am I not going to give you anything," but he insulted David. He called him essentially a runaway slave and said, "Who are you? I've never heard of you. Why should I give you anything?" Now, David was understandably furious. His men risked their lives to keep Nabal's shepherds and flocks safe. And Nabal called them escaped slaves, said he had never heard of David when everybody knew that David was the legitimate king of Israel. So David might have overreacted a little bit. He said, "Everybody strap on your swords, we're going after Nabal." Now, there was no contract, there was no agreement. It was a gentleman's understanding on the frontier that if somebody's out there helping protect your herds, you support them. So technically, Nabal didn't owe anything in that way, but he certainly owed a debt of gratitude, which he refused to give. But it wasn't something that necessarily deserved death, at least not by civil authorities. The king didn't have a right to go and kill somebody because they didn't hold up their end of a bargain. That's not within the king's power. But, you know, one of Nabal's men saw what happened and saw Nabal's reaction to these 10 men, and he went to his wife, Abigail, Nabal's wife. And he knew better than to go to Nabal because Nabal was a jerk. He went to Abigail and he said, "Hey, Abigail, Nabal mistreated David's men, and you know, this is all that David did for us, and David is a great man, and he is going to be furious, and he's going to come and he's going to kill Nabal and all the men in your house." So Abigail, the faithful wife, despite Nabal's terrible character, she went and she got way more than David had asked for. She got like 200 gallons of flour. I don't remember how much it was. I'm just kind of making numbers up. There was 200 loaves of bread and a bunch of grapes and animals that had already been butchered and dressed. And she said, "We're going to give all of this to David." And it was way more than he ever would have asked for. She went out and she met him on the road, him and his war party. And she bowed down on the ground and she said, "Don't blame all of us for my husband's terrible behavior. Here, take all of this and spare us. Spare Nabal for my sake. And David was so impressed that he heaped praises back on her. He accepted the offer and he went away. Now Abigail went back home, and by this time Nabal was falling down drunk. You know, he's throwing a party, he might as well take part in it too. But he passed out. The next morning he woke up, and Abigail told him what had happened, that David was coming to kill him and all of his sons and everybody in his household because Nabal had been so ungrateful. Nabal was so scared, he had a stroke. He lay in a coma for 10 days, and on the 10th day, God killed him. A king doesn't have a right to kill somebody for breaking a contract. God does. And God thought that Nabal's ingratitude, his false accusations against David, despite the fact that Nabal didn't have a contract or a formal agreement with David, God thought it was so offensive that he would be so ungrateful that God took Nabal's life. David came back, said, Abigail, you are such an amazing woman. Your husband was such a jerk and you put up with him and you protected him. You should come be my wife. So Abigail was a great woman. She was generous. She was grateful to the protection that David gave, even though there was no formal agreement between them. They were good neighbors. David was grateful that she kept him from a terrible sin of murdering her husband. When somebody does something good for you, when somebody's a good host or a good neighbor, you be good too. I mean, you don't have to wait for them to be good, but returning good deeds with enmity, being a general jerk, man, God doesn't like that. This is Jay Carper from American Torah. Be blessed.